Hello, my name is Diane Halford. I'm an archival researcher, an associate of AGRA and the co-founder of In Search of Anne Walker. This presentation is about searching for Anne Walker, better known as the partner of Anne Lister of Shibden Hall, the renowned prolific diarist. Lister left such a vast volume of diaries it allows us a glimpse into the intimacies of her world that could be said to be unrivalled for a woman of her era. Anne Walker was one of her partners and is probably the better known due to the BBC TV production Gentleman Jack, written by Sally Wainwright. It became apparent to those interested in Anne Walker that the previous research into Walker had almost exclusively relied on the words of Lister from her diaries, with very little research into Anne Walker outside of the time that she was partnered with Anne Lister or her own documents during her time with Lister. It soon became apparent that some of the things that we had relied on as truths about Walker's life were in fact myths. A deeper dive into the life of Anne Walker would be necessary to bring her out of the shadows of Anne Lister and into her own spotlight. In Search of Anne Walker was co-founded in 2020 by myself and two other researchers. We're a research collaborative where researchers from all over the world come together to tell Anne's story. We've made almost 50 archive visits searching for Anne and looked through over 15,000 documents, piecing together small clues in these documents that tell us the fuller picture of Anne's life. So what do we know about Anne Walker? Well, she was born in Lightcliffe near Halifax in 1803, the fourth of 5 children born to wealthy textile merchant John Walker and his wife Mary Edwards. She spent her early childhood at her family home in Cliff Hill in Lightcliffe. After the death of her uncle, who died without issue in 1809, her father John inherited the rest of the vast Walker estate, and the family then moved to the more substantial family seat of Crow Nest. Anne and her siblings would have had a typical upbringing for children of wealthy Georgian parents: education, hobbies and social pursuits suitable for their station in society. Only Anne, her older sister Elizabeth and her younger brother John survived to become adults. After the death of both of their parents in 1823, John would now inherit the whole estate, which he did once he had reached his majority in 1825. Anne and Elizabeth were left substantial income from their father, making them independently wealthy and marriage-worthy for the time. During this period, we know that Anne and Anne knew each other socially, as Anne Lister's diaries mention the family's respective social calls, and indeed at one point the older Lister in 1822 refers to teenage Anne as a stupid, vulgar girl. How things changed. There is not an abundance of material in the archives about Anne's early life. Indeed, it is merely crumbs, mostly written by other people, Lister included, but there are mentions in letters and diaries of relatives and friends, even some strangers, and occasional legal and accounting documents also mention Anne during this period. It was here that we found one of the first notes Anne Walker ever wrote to Anne Lister in 1820 when Anne was only 17 years old. They were found in Anne Lister's documents in the Shibden Hall collection at West Yorkshire Archives, but they only survived because it was written all over by Anne Lister with notes from a book that she was reading a few weeks after the original note arrived. This note had been missed for years because of those scribbled book notes on top of it. Interestingly, Anne Walker signs off this note, "You're very affectionate," and Anne Lister mentions this in her famed diaries, stating, "I wonder if she likes me." Anne travelled with her siblings and a chaperone, Mrs. Rawson, in the period after her parents died. In 1825 they visited Bath, Weymouth and London. She also attended dinner parties and social occasions at Crow Nest, all of this information coming from letters and diaries of visitors and family in the archives. Anne's sister Elizabeth married in 1828 and her brother John married in 1829, and then Anne Walker moves into Lydgate, a smaller home on the Walker estate. Anne's brother John dies on his honeymoon in Naples in 1830, but he dies intestate without a will, and a legal battle with his widow and the 2 remaining Walker siblings, Anne and Elizabeth, commences. They eventually settle with the widow and inherit the large estate between them. It was at Lydgate where the courtship of Anne by Lister in 1832 plays out. Anne experienced a period of mental ill health during the courtship, which led her to visit her sister, who's now living in Scotland with her husband and children, in order to recover. Anne Lister goes on her own travels during this time, and when they both return to Halifax in late 1833, Anne arranges for medical help through Dr. Belcombe for Anne to further recover at some lodgings in York under his watchful eye. Walker and Lister considered themselves married after exchanging rings and then taking communion together at Holy Trinity Gudrun in York at Easter in 1834. It is from York that Anne and Anne embark upon their honeymoon to the continent, visiting London first and then travelling through France to Switzerland. This is the first of many travel adventures they had together, touring around England and the continent. In the archives, we discovered a letter written by Anne and Anne's solicitor, Robert Parker, to his father, and it describes Anne and Anne's relationship as this. Miss Lister of Shibden Hall and Miss Walker of Crownest are gone upon the continent. These two ladies, most different in appearances and pursuits, have formed the strongest intimacy. In October 2020, my visit to the West Yorkshire Archive Service in Halifax to look at possible documents mentioning Anne Walker included a travel journal attributed to Anne Lister. Upon looking at this closely, it led to the realisation, and I must say a most exciting realisation, that it was in fact Anne Walker's travel journal that covered this honeymoon period and a short term after their return, when she had moved into Shibden Hall to live with Lister. This journal was in the Rawson collection, and to date it is the only known diary of Anne Walker. This was an amazing chance to hear what Anne Walker had to say in her own words, written for herself. The journal covers June 1834, leaving York to go abroad, to February 1835, when they have returned and settled into living together at Shibden Hall. We found that Walker's pet name for Lister was Dearest. It further reveals a witty woman who enjoyed travelling and was not afraid to speak her mind. An example would be her commenting on the Roman baths in Clermont. Below, at a little distance, stand some baths which people say were built by Romans and what Caesar used. Appearance does not incline one to believe either part of this story. Most of Anne and Anne's 8 years together is told through the eyes and voice of Lister in her diaries. It involved managing their estates, travelling abroad and at home, renovations to Shibden Hall, social calls, and spending their evenings together, drawing, reading, writing letters and researching family history. Much of this life can now be easily read in the newly transcribed Anne Lister diaries and are freely available on the West Yorkshire Archive Service's website. They left for their final journey together in June 1839, visiting Scandinavia and Imperial Russia, where they visited Moscow and St. Petersburg, eventually travelling down a frozen Volga River and getting as far as Baku in modern-day Azerbaijan. They definitely had an exciting adventure together, but unfortunately Anne Lister became ill in modern-day Georgia and died on the 22nd of September 1840. Anne was now alone in a relatively unexplored country. It was long held that Anne accompanied Lister's body back to England in a journey that took 9 months. However, from a letter in the West Yorkshire Archive Service where Anne writes back to the land steward of her estate and tells him to go on, fearlessly do your duty, in December 1840, we know Walker returned to Moscow, likely to pick up the carriage and belongings that her and Lister had left there when they went journeying towards the lesser travelled parts of Russia. From the legal case in the National Archives, we discovered a line item in the accounts that states Anne Lister's body was shipped from Trebizond, modern-day Trabzon, on the Black Sea, which was very close to where she died. We also found a letter between 2 of her brother-in-law's brothers describing the intentions of their brother, George Mackay Sutherland, to travel to Moscow or Tbilisi to accompany Anne Walker home. Furthermore, digging through the Foreign Office records in the National Archive, we identified passports in the Warsaw Embassy files that noted Anne Walker and her sister's husband, George Mackay Sutherland, travelling from Warsaw to Paris together, thus changing the assumption that Anne accompanied Lister's body home with the fact that they took different routes. Walker chose to live in the marital home Shibden Hall upon return to Halifax in February 1841. She set about changing her will and helping to organise her wife's funeral, although she now had to manage two estates, hers and Lister's, as she had been left a life interest in the Shibden estate. In early 1843, Anne's business decisions began to give cause for concern. She was fined in the local courts for seeing off the ordnance survey off her land, sued in court for several unpaid debts, and started ignoring legal advice. This all came to a head, and she left Shibden Hall in September 1843 to stay at Terrace House, a private asylum in Baldwick, York. She remained there for about 7 to 8 months. While she was at Terrace House, it was decided that in order to protect herself and her estate, she should be subject to a lunacy inquisition, which happened at the Royal Hotel in Brighouse in November 1843. She was found to be of unsound mind and could no longer make decisions for herself. After she left Terrace House, she went to London with her sister and family, eventually living at Abbey Lodge in Merton, Surrey, where her sister, Elizabeth, died of TB in December 1844. We discovered in the National Archives that Anne spent time in another private asylum whilst in London from a bond that her brother-in-law paid in order to be her committee to make her decisions. This private asylum was called Sussex House, and it still exists today in Hammersmith. She did not stay there long and soon returned to Shibden Hall with her brother-in-law and his family. By April 1845, her brother-in-law, Anne Walker, his family and household, including Anne's attendants, a governess and a tutor, moved back up to Yorkshire and into Shibden Hall. As Anne's committee, George could not live very far from her. Her life at Shibden would have been similar to her previous post-Lister life, reading, drawing, letter writing, riding her pony, but without the estate management. Indeed, in a legal bill it states that when a chancery master had come for his annual visit to check in on Anne, he found her riding unaccompanied, and he let her committee know this was not okay. In April 1847, Captain Sutherland, her brother-in-law, died. New committees were appointed to make decisions for Anne, and a lifelong friend, Lydia Fenton, born Lydia Wilkinson, moved into Shibden Hall to be with her. Her aunt Anne Walker also died at the end of 1847, leaving Walker's childhood home empty. Anne and Lydia then moved back into the home Walker was born in, Cliff Hill. Anne remained at Cliff Hill until her death on the 25th of February 1854 at the age of 50. She was buried in Lightcliff St Matthew's Church under the pulpit in a vault with two of her aunts. To find out more about Anne Walker or to read her journal, please visit our website at insearchofanwalker.com or add us to your socials. You can also download a free PDF about her life from our website. So thank you for listening to our talk about searching for Anne Walker.